The last time I saw my unit, they were all around me, looking at me as if it were the final time, and in fact it was. I couldn't even utter a word before everything turned to chaos. I was in the middle of a mission unfolding faster than I could process. Then, when the explosion hit loud and deafening, it was as if the world had gone dark. The sound, the heat, the smoke, everything became distant, unrecognizable. When I came to, there was no one left. The battlefield was silent, and the reality of being alone in that devastated land began to creep into my mind. I knew they'd find my body in a few hours. They always do, eventually. But by some miracle, or perhaps something crueler, I was alive, and there was no one around me, just a vast expanse of desolation, a place where time didn't pass, and fear seemed to have settled into my veins. I was completely alone, with nothing but a torn backpack and the memory of a world that no longer existed. The first days were a desperate struggle to understand what had happened. The pain in my left leg, where shrapnel had struck, was almost unbearable, but the fear of dying without dignity was stronger. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I felt increasingly distant from everything I knew. The war had shaped me to survive, and now alone, that skill became my only hope. Survive, just survive. I didn't know how long I could keep going, but the void of death seemed more terrifying than the pain, so I pressed on. Each step grew harder but also more necessary. Every scrap of food I found was a victory. Every thread of hope, no matter how faint, kept me moving forward. But what hurt most wasn't the lack of food or water, it was the silence. I was used to the noise of war, the sound of orders, the shouts of comrades, even the sound of death in every corner. Now, everything was dead. Just me and the land that, with each passing day, seemed to swallow me more. The days dragged on. Hunger and thirst became constant companions, and I began to lose track of time. Every movement was a battle against my own body, against the limits I knew were imposed by nature and war. At times, I wondered if I was truly alive, or if what remained was just a shadow trying to outlast the inevitable. The scorching sun seemed to devour my energy faster than I could replenish it, and the pain in my leg, once bearable, was now a constant torment, a cruel reminder of everything I'd lost on that battlefield. I dragged myself from one makeshift shelter to another, hiding from the vegetation that seemed to want to consume me, and from the fear that followed every step. Loneliness weighed like a burden, but at the same time, it became a shield. There was no one left to tell me what to do or to share the weight of decisions. I was the only one responsible, and that thought, though overwhelming, brought a strange sense of freedom. There were no rules but my own, and that forced me to look inward, to tap into everything I knew about resilience. Every night I spent awake, staring at the stars, barely piercing through the thick layer of smoke, still lingering over the field, reminded me of who I was before all this. But at the same time, the war had shaped me into something else, a survivor, a hunter, someone who no longer had the luxury of dwelling on what was lost, only on what could still be gained. It was in those first nights that the real battle began. The sound of silence was crushing. I had grown accustomed to the noises of war, gunfire, orders, the sounds of living people around me, but now, nothing. Just the rustling of vegetation and my own thoughts. At times, what scared me most wasn't the hunger or the fear, but the realization that I was starting to lose control over my own mind. When dreams came, they were nightmares, flashes of faces I no longer recognized, memories distorted by pain and loss. I knew the war had done this to me, that my comrades, my friends were gone, but what I didn't know was whether my body and mind could endure more. Each passing day, a part of me died a little more, yet I kept going because the alternative, complete surrender to the darkness, seemed more terrifying than any battle. And so, 1 hour at a time, I forced my body to continue. On the 9th day, I finally managed to make a fire. It was a struggle. The stones were wet, the wood too green to catch, and I had no matches, just an old lighter I found in one of the backpack's pockets, mocking me by refusing to work. But when the sparks finally took shape and the flames began to dance before me, it was as if the entire world paused for a second. I had done it. I had found a way. The smell of smoke filled my lungs, and for the first time in days, a sense of accomplishment washed over me, even if it was just a small fire, a simple sign that I could still do something. It gave me what? I needed a sense of control. In the silence of the field, that flame reminded me that even lost in a hostile place, there was still something inside me that couldn't be destroyed. With fire came water, and with water, finally, a chance to breathe a little deeper, to regain strength, to think more clearly. I began to move more methodically. I started building better shelters, setting traps to hunt more efficiently. But the real change came on the 12th day, when I found a water source. It was a small spring bubbling up from a hidden stream, its crystal clear, water glinting under the softening sunlight. That moment was a turning point. I had never felt so close to victory as I did then. The water didn't just keep me alive. It gave me the feeling that everything I had endured until that point had been worth it. I was no longer just a survivor. I was beginning to understand what that meant. I was becoming someone capable of defying the impossible, someone who had learned to fight not only against what was around me, but against what was within me. But even with progress, the loneliness tortured me. During the day, I could focus on the task at hand, on what I needed to do to stay alive. But at night, when exhaustion took over and the silence became even more oppressive, it was impossible to ignore the ghosts in my mind. Memories of friends who were no longer there, recollections of a war that still haunted me, all of it surfaced in the darkest moments. I knew I wasn't just fighting to survive physically. I was fighting against what the war had left in me, against the weight of losses that couldn't be erased, against the man I was before and the man I was still trying to become. But deep down, I knew the only way to move forward was to confront those shadows. I couldn't get lost in them, and with every step I took, every day that passed, I knew there was more to me than just survival. There was a silent strength pushing me forward, a strength I didn't know I had until I was forced to use it. And finally, I realized that even alone, even with no one to hear, I was starting to win. In the days that followed, the challenge was no longer just the terrain, the lack of food, or the constant fear of another explosion. The real challenge began within me. The loneliness, once a silent shadow, now became a constant presence. The desperation of not knowing if I would be found, of not knowing if my struggle was worth it, began to erode my mind in ways I hadn't expected. Even when I hunted or set traps, the feeling of being a lost soul in a devastated field continued to haunt me. I had survived, yes, but what was happening to my mind? Every time I lay down at night, the memories of the war grew sharper, more vivid. The face of Jake, that kid who fought by my side, still haunted me, his eyes reminding me of everything we lost and what still needed to be overcome. I tried to keep busy with tasks, with the search for more food, with the damned fire that never seemed to light fast enough, but my head was elsewhere. I kept running from something I couldn't touch, something I didn't know how to stop. What hurt most wasn't the loneliness, but the loss of identity. Who was I before being thrown into this hell? I was a soldier, but now, with no one to command, my steps, without the military discipline that guided every move. Who was I? The memories of the war, the laughter and the screams, everything that had happened before I was left behind, all of it seemed to blur, lose shape. I felt as if I was slowly breaking apart, as if I were losing the only thing that could keep me sane, a reason to keep going. With every step I asked myself, why survive if there was nothing left in me but survival? But something inside me refused to accept that. Somewhere deep in my mind, there was still a spark. A memory of the lessons my superiors had taught me, a recollection of all the battles I'd won before, and I knew with stark clarity that this battle would be won too. I needed, more than ever, to reconnect with what remained of me, with the strengths the war had taught me to use. I forced myself to train my mind, to focus on what I could control. The silence of the night, the wind in the trees, the sound of water running in the stream. I began to hear these things with a strange clarity, as if nature were trying to teach me something I had forgotten. I didn't need to fight my fears. I needed to accept them, use them, transform them into the energy needed to keep going. That's when I found the cliff, a rocky outcrop rising above the rest of the terrain, with a view that seemed infinite. I approached cautiously, not sure what I was looking for, but when I got there, something inside me calmed. The view from up there made me realize something simple yet profound. I was alive, and as alone as I was, there was still a world out there, still something for me beyond the suffering. I didn't know how, but I knew that surviving all this, facing my own demons, was the first step to reclaiming what I had lost. I was no longer lost. I was just beginning to find what remained of me. As the days passed, I began to realize that my greatest struggle wasn't outside of me. It wasn't the hunger, the heat, or the relentless thirst that consumed me. It was the silent battle in my head. The memories of the war returned constantly, dragging me back to battlefields I couldn't leave behind. When silence settled around me, the memories grew more vivid, sharper. Jake's face, the sounds of explosions, the tension in every move. But amid the whirlwind of recollections, something began to change. I started to understand that I couldn't keep running from my memories. I needed to face them. The war, though it had taken so much from me, also taught me that strength didn't come solely from physical endurance. It came from the mind. It came from facing pain and continuing, even when everything inside you screamed to give up. The loneliness consumed me less, not because it ceased to exist, but because I learned to use it. I began to focus on small victories, every trap I managed to set, every successful hunt, every drop of water I found, healed a part of me. I had learned to survive, not just physically but mentally, and when the memories hit harder, I let them in, allowing myself to feel the loss, the pain, but not letting them consume me. The weight of guilt, of knowing I had been left behind, that others were dead while I was here alone, grew lighter with time. Maybe there was no sense in it, but surviving had become my purpose. And slowly, I found a way to accept that the life I knew, with all its certainties, would never return. But that didn't mean I couldn't build a new life, a new version of myself. On the 30th day, loneliness finally lost its power over me. I began to walk the terrain with more confidence, mapping routes, setting more efficient traps. I was learning to live again. But the biggest step came when I found myself once more at the cliff. The wind blew strong, and I felt a deep connection to that place, as if it were mine. The vastness before me was no longer a threat, but an opportunity, a vantage, a point that reminded me I wasn't alone in the world. The war had taught me to look forward, even when everything around me seemed dark. The future was still out there, even if I didn't know how to reach it. And for the first time, I didn't feel afraid to look at the abyss before me. I faced it, knowing I had overcome so much that now there was nothing I couldn't confront. CT, final days before being found, became a blend of uncertainty and a strange acceptance. I no longer knew exactly how time passed, and hunger and thirst became constant companions that were starting to weigh on me physically. But deep down, there was a greater force, a will to live, that seemed to carry me even when my body had no Strength left. I knew somehow that I was close to being rescued. I didn't know how or when, but something in me told me the end of this nightmare was approaching. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a silent certainty that consumed me entirely. Yet, when I finally heard the helicopters in the distance, an unexpected panic gripped me. I was thrown back to the battlefield with the screams and chaos, and for a moment the idea of being found didn't feel liberating, but terrifying. The war had taught me to fight for my life, but it had also taught me to live in solitude, where the only certainties were the ones I created. The world I would leave behind, the world awaiting me, no longer felt like mine. And the idea of returning to it, of having to face society, expectations, and gazes again, left me uncertain. I didn't know if I could be who I was before, or if perhaps I had lost myself entirely in the process. When the military finally found me, I could hardly believe it. The voices and faces around me were like a second layer of distortion, as if I had emerged from one nightmare only to be greeted by another, entirely different one. The rescue wasn't what I had imagined. There were no warm embraces or words of heroism. There was compassion in their eyes, but also distance. They were there to save me physically, but the real battle was still internal. I was a stranger in a world that to me seemed to have drifted away while I was isolated. The Ryan who had left days ago was different from the one who returned. The world awaiting me no longer felt like mine. And though I was physically safe, the question remained, how do I move forward now? When I was taken back to the base, the first weeks were a blur. The warmth of the paramedics' hands trying to stabilize my body, the constant hum of machines, voices speaking too quickly, expecting answers I couldn't process. Nothing felt real. I was back, yes, but as if looking through a window, a distant observer of the life around me. The food tasted bland, the water made me nauseous, and even the sound of friendly voices, or what they tried to call welcomes, irritated me in a way I couldn't explain. They were happy to see me back, but me? I was lost, like a loose leaf, trying to cling to something that always seemed just out of reach. When I was finally cleared to return home, the feeling of being back in society was overwhelming. The streets, the noise of cars, the frenetic pace of people moving back and forth, everything felt foreign. Part of me longed for this return, for a routine, but part of me felt as if I had woken up in a nightmare. I didn't know where I fit anymore. I wasn't the same man who had gone to war. I didn't know how to explain that, nor did I know if I'd ever find my place again. The first encounters with my family were strange. They looked at me with concern and affection, but also with distance. That look of someone who doesn't know how to touch another without breaking them. I was welcomed with open arms, but deep down, I knew something had changed irreversibly. Words of affection were no longer enough. They wanted to see the man I used to be, but that man was buried under layers of pain and loss I could barely understand, let alone share. They asked how I was, and I responded with meaningless phrases. I'm fine. I'm adjusting. I lied, but it was the kind of lie that let me keep existing without having to explain what I really felt. Without having to admit that the pain didn't fade with time, I spent the first days wandering the house like a ghost. Sometimes I sat on the porch, staring at the street, but I didn't really see anything. My mind was far away, in a place no one else understood. No matter how hard they tried to bring me back, the truth was I didn't know how to fit into the life I had left behind, and I didn't know how to stop being the man the war had forced me to become. Slowly, I forced myself to step out of the bubble I was hiding in. The first thing I did was seek a therapist, something I would never have considered before. It went against all my beliefs. The idea of opening my mind, of talking about what I'd been through, seemed weak, too fragile for a man who prided himself on the toughness the war had forged. But there was no other way. Every night was a silent battle against the memories, the screams, the fear that the images of war would consume me entirely. I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know how to be, how to communicate with my family, how to look at my own reflection without feeling shame for what I had become. In the therapist's office, the words came out hesitantly, disorganized. I talked about the battlefield, the loss of my friends, the desperation of being so alone. But what scared me most wasn't recounting the scenes of war. It was the feeling of falling into an endless abyss. Every word felt like an opening, a crack, and I was afraid that once I started talking, the shadows would take over, swallowing me whole. But as time passed, something began to change. The therapist, with their calm and patience, didn't force me to be more than I was ready to be, but guided me little by little to a place where I could look at my pain without fear of being crushed by it. It was hard to admit, but I realized I couldn't move forward alone. I needed help, not just to cope with the trauma, but to learn to live again. What scared me most was knowing, deep down, that the war was still inside me, and it wouldn't be easy to leave it behind. But I began to understand that what I did, now the choices I made from that moment on, had the power to heal what was broken. I didn't need to erase the past, but I could learn to live with it. And more importantly, I could choose not to let it define me. My family, though quiet about the changes happening, began to notice something different in me. It wasn't exactly progress, but a shift, a way of becoming present again. The afternoons on the porch grew longer. I started talking about small moments from my life before the war, before everything changed. The simple act of reconnecting with what was before seemed like a miracle. Sometimes I found myself smiling again, not quite understanding why, but smiling with a hope that had been lost for so long. But still, there was the weight of sleepless nights, the weight of memories, the weight of what the war had done to me. I knew the battle wasn't over, that the road ahead would be long, that I couldn't simply overcome everything that had happened. But for the first time, I was willing to fight to find a version of myself that could live without drowning in the past. I was learning that surviving the war didn't mean just escaping death, but also facing what couldn't be left behind. The real test began as the weeks passed, and the reality of living with what the war had left me became clearer. I was trying to find balance, trying to fit into a world that, before being thrown into chaos, had seemed so simple, so straightforward. The feeling of being lost didn't vanish immediately. There were days when sadness hit without warning, and I found myself trying to understand how someone who had lived so intensely, who had known the brutality of war, could now adapt to the calm of everyday life. But what surprised me most was the kindness I began to show myself. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but I started to see that my journey didn't need to be marked only by pain. I had survived, and that in itself meant something. I was learning to see it as a victory. I began connecting with other veterans who had been through similar experiences. At first, it was hard to open my heart because every shared story reminded me of everything I'd tried to bury. But as I listened to the voices of men and women who also carried their own scars, I began to realize something profound. I wasn't alone. Our stories were different, but the suffering we carried and the internal battles we fought were the same. We shared the pain of loss, the pain of adaptation, the pain of being forced to change in ways we couldn't fully comprehend. It was with them that I began to rebuild what I had lost. Together, we shared strategies for coping with PTSD, talked about the challenges of being a stranger in the world around us. The war wouldn't disappear. The images, the sounds, the memories would never fully fade. But by forming a new support network, I learned to deal with it, not as an overwhelming burden, but as something that was part of who I am, something that, with time, became easier to carry. My family also began to notice the difference. It wasn't a drastic change, not a click, but over time they saw I was more present, more open. I started reclaiming small moments with them, the ones that once seemed trivial. An afternoon fishing with my dad, a walk in the park with my sister. I was learning to live again, not out of willpower or the obligation to be what others wanted me to be, but because I was slowly starting to see that life could be precious again. Even with the scars, even with the ghosts, there was still a long way to go. I knew that. But the difference was in how I saw the path ahead. Before, it was a path of hopelessness. Now it was a path that, though long and difficult, carried the promise of a possible future. I didn't know exactly what awaited me, but something in me finally had the courage to look forward. I had faced my own darkness and survived it. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all.